Welcome back to Lepide CISO Talks, the show where we dig into the strategies and stories behind today's cybersecurity leaders. Today, I'm joined by Chris Borkenhagen, the Chief Digital Officer and CISO at Authentic ID. Chris has a fascinating background that spans military service, startup culture, and executive leadership at the highest levels, but I'll let him tell you more. Chris, for those who may not know you yet, can you give us a quick overview of your journey and what you're focused on at Authentic ID?
Sure. Well, thanks, first of all, Battalion Daniel. Appreciate you having me on here. I always feel humbled when asked to do these. So it's great to be a part of your profession and sort of what you're providing to the industry, if you will. Yeah, where do I begin? Gosh, okay. I'm Canadian. We'll start with that. So now you can throw all your daggers and swords at me. And you can poke fun at our military or lack thereof. But I do live in the US and I've been here for 25 years now. So getting close to 50% of my life. And I know that that in self could conjure up maybe some embroiled conversations in today's climate, along with other things. But it's been a great journey, especially because of the aforementioned sort of technology in my profession, software specifically, in the last 25 years on the West Coast of the United States, including California. So that's where I'm at. But where did it all begin? Man, I definitely, resonate with your British accent, and so you'll appreciate this. I actually went to an English boarding school for my high school years, 9, 10, 11, 12. And I was actually speaking with a friend of mine the other day, and she said, "Did they have beatings and corporal punishment back then?" I said, "Absolutely. I was caned 3 times for crimes and misdemeanors that today's society would not accept or tolerate a beating for, nonetheless, any sort of punishment." But yeah, so I think that carved a path to where I ended up eventually in the military, although there was no correlation to the two, except I tried college, didn't enjoy it, found it aimless. Let's go represent my country and learn something and travel at the same time. So, um, military was great. Honestly, not many people will say that. In fact, I just found myself watching American Sniper last night, appreciating that very coveted role and dangerous and psychologically testing profession in itself.
Did you catch as many beatings as you did at the British boarding school
No
in the
beatings,
Navy?
no beatings. I never actually had the opportunity to do active service. It was 1988 to 1991, so right on the cusp of the first Gulf War. In fact, my release discharge date, honorable, was January 15th, which was the initiated date for the Gulf War by US against Iraq, right? Yeah. So that was
And
in.
also around the time that I was born in '89, to show my age, and also the collapse of the Soviet Union. I did hear on one of the other podcasts that you mentioned something about you were spotting submarines. Were
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Russians in the Canadian waters?
Yeah, and that was, look, honestly, that the Russians were the targeted enemy at the time in that world war, or that sort of silent war, if you will. Yeah, we were sub hunters, or I was posted on a sub hunting destroyer escort, or I guess a destroyer escort, as Canadian Navy nomenclature goes. Right. We were both passive and active towed array sonar, so a lot of ping work, if you will. Hunt for Red October is a great analogy movie for that, but also passive, which is one big, massive microphone towed behind a ship at varying sea depths to hunt for the elusive Russian subs.
Well, full disclosure, actually, my grandmother, who comes from a very small town in the north of Russia, sort of white nights in the summer and long cold winters. But she actually used to do a bit of the soldering on the nuclear subs there. A completely closed town. It's where my mum's from. But yeah, maybe you're the technology intersected at that point. But
Possibly.
yeah.
Hopefully her welds were good and they weren't leaking any noise towards our towed array sonars.
So we've been working with Magic Mind now since April, and I've been using it over the last couple of months. And to be honest, I'm still impressed. It's a small shot that I take in the morning, and over time, I've noticed
I'm a lot sharper during those long stretches of meetings and deep focus work. It's not a quick caffeine buzz, it's more like a sustained clarity that actually lasts throughout the day. In the cybersecurity world, that kind of focus really helps, especially when you're juggling strategy, threats, and firefighting all in one afternoon. If you'd like to give it a try, head on over to magicmind.com/CISO June and use the code CISO June for a discount. That's magicmind.com/CISO June, and the code again is CISO June.
I mean, obviously, this it's really interesting. Military backgrounds. We've had a lot of other guests on the show. Who've come from, special forces or the military, and do you feel that that's kind of translated into your various roles throughout your career? The way that you operate, the way that you lead teams, for example.
Yes and no. I mean, for sure, there's a foundation one, which is just hierarchical and chain of command born, right? And it's instilled in you from literally the day you enter the gates for boot camp or basic training, if you will. And I think it's interesting to share the psychology behind what boot training's intent is meant to be, right? It's not just understanding how to take a command and or provide commands or structure or guidance or follow, but it's to, strip you of your identity, perhaps remove any sense of moral compass from you so that you as a group or an individual will do exactly as you're told and trained to do, regardless of the circumstances. And I'd say that's a little harsh in the private environment, right? And in a personal environment.
Sure.
But in warfare, given, I think what we see today with Ukraine and Russia and how we feel and emote things we may not be on board with, that's the game in military, right? Is to trust that your team members will do as they need to do, have been trained to do, whether they believe in it or not. And you constantly see these in documentaries these days. I don't know why we're fighting this war, blah, blah, blah. So,
Well, there's
uh,
a lot of analogies, aren't there, between warfare and doing business and cybersecurity,
yeah,
offense and defense, isn't it? So,
yes. Yeah.
when teams approach it from with that sort of perspective, I guess yeah, the skills do translate quite effectively. But
And just I didn't fully answer the question. I think there's a lot of great foundational framework that I gained from being in the military. And, sometimes I've been called, Chris is like a Navy SEAL in a business environment. You give him a task, he'll go accomplish it without any doubt, and he'll achieve the result. It's not always the friendliest approach sometimes, but I can be a little bit stubborn as a result of that. I think those are good traits at the end of the day because it creates trustworthiness and accountability. So what happened after the military? I spent 3 years there, which is your typical sort of first stint sign up in the Canadian military, if you will. And then I left and went back to college. I went into construction. I built homes for about 4 years and worked for a variety of set of leaders or business owners. And I think in itself builds character, right? And I look back on this often today as like, why do I operate the way I do? And why do I think, I don't know if it's okay to swear on this show, but dollar sign people exists in a business, private, public, whatever world. And what are you meant to learn from those experiences? A lot. I worked for two bosses at the time building houses. They were absolute jerks, and I'm sure they'll never listen to this podcast, but maybe they should, um, because they're in different industries.
it's like
Yeah, I mean,
therapy for you, yeah.
it's totally therapy. Thanks, Vitaly. Spent 5 years doing that, and then I continued on probably for 10 years within construction and manufacturing. I went into manufacturing in the pulp side of the world, pulp and paper industry, logging, forestry. And I sort of resurrected some of those engineering technology skills I had inherited and learned in the military and started working on the machinery side, managing different distributions of recycled paper and woodborne pulp. Interesting, brain-numbing job. And while the pay was good, the time off was good. I was doing graveyard shifts for 5 years, half days, half graveyards, and I if there was ever a time I felt like I didn't understand the point of life, it was at 2 a.m. working in a manufacturing plant making paper. And that was motivating for me to find a way back to school, which is where I ended up.
I think the UK equivalent of that would be like stacking shelves at 2 a.m. in a Tesco or a Sainsbury's, um, which I'm
Yeah, and
sure
no
can
offense to
also,
anyone that,
yeah.
yeah, no offense to people that do that. I've had a
No,
lot of friends that spent
of
time in
course
there,
not.
and
That yeah,
but that
that's
wasn't
how
for
you
me. Let's
you
just say
earn
that.
your gap year spending money typically. Straight out of school, stacking shelves at Tesco.
Sainsbury and Tesco. That's funny. Yeah. Yeah. So, had an opportunity. The Canadian government or one of the provinces I lived in and worked in was offering incentive part of deforestation in Canada and trying to reduce and eliminate environmental waste and whatnot. So the government, God love them in this case, stepped in and provided incentives and stipends to employees within those areas to go back to college. So pay for their entire college tuition program and your living costs. And then the company in itself fulfilled some of that financial burden on me. So I went right back to college as soon as that door opened and then entered really the technology spectrum. So I attended Royal Roads University in Victoria, British Columbia, which was an ex-military college, but not when I went there. Uh, they'd converted to a public institution at that point, and thus ensued my whole. I studied Microsoft Technology Stack, the old MCSE certification program for those that may remember that. And that turned into networking and administration and configuration and owning the IT stack in a business world, including mail and business applications. So that was sort of the re-entry into technology. It's always been on the background. I was sort of playing around with, you know, Commodore 64 and then, the first Windows machine that came to market in DOS. And so after that, I went and worked for Microsoft for a year at Exchange Server 5.5. That was a fun journey, just being at the Microsoft campus in 2000, during the 2000.com boom and bust, and watching how a large enterprise software company builds, manufactures, tests, develops, releases, goes to market, sells, services customers. What a great place. Almost like the military as far as just becoming a structured individual in life. Working for Microsoft back then was eye-opening in many ways. I still think that was almost a great boot camp in itself for the software industry and where I am today.
I mean, you're not the kind of guest that was like programming from the age of 13 and starting businesses. It's always, one thing's led to another, and you've clearly, found your roots in the IT space and have gone down the rabbit hole. And it all wasn't always, where you're at today with authentic ID, fraud prevention, and the cybersecurity. What led you to that then, to sort of the present day?
Yeah, if I can give you a little vignette to a ski chairlift ride I had with a cousin of mine 2 years ago,
Yeah, I dig it.
and
I'm a
he
skier.
was, he was he's a psychology PhD at this point in his career, so he loves to study minds. And when family get on a chairlift, well, what a great place to, unpack someone's head, especially a family member. And he made a comment that has stuck and resonated with me since. He's like, you and your dad, you're like entrepreneurial hustlers. You didn't really go to school for one specific criteria curriculum, and yet you've become successful in one or many as a result. And at first I thought hustler doesn't have the greatest reference to it because I think of hustler in many different sort of definitions. But then I've thought about it for 2 years, like, what's wrong with that, right? I mean, entrepreneurs or startup founders are hustlers. They're trying to figure out how to solve a problem that presents a challenge in any way, means, or possibility you can. So, um, I've forgotten your question, Vitali, but I think it was what? Oh, how do I end up in IT? Yeah. Um,
Well,
I
more the
think
cybersecurity path,
right, right.
to where we're at today.
Beyond the late night parties in garages at Microsoft after releasing shipping code, the underpinnings for what I was doing, which was breaking software or quality assurance testing, really revealed gaps in both hardware-borne, devices that supported software and the multitude of different ways to input a command to generate an output, right? And so, I was a quality assurance tester at the root back then, and my job was to test the MAPI client for Exchange Server 5.5, so Outlook, if you will. And ideally, not test the good paths. Everyone does that in its own right. It's test the bad paths. And I quickly realized that, man, there are no shortages of bad paths to find backdoors into software. And so that career sort of unfolded into leading. Somehow someone thought I would be a good leader and gave me a couple team members, one who is still my best friend, although I almost fired him after the first 3 months of working with him. Um, and so two tangents occurred, right? I started to understand how technology supported enterprise spaces, small, medium, large, and a consumer at that level or an enterprise consumer. And then I started to lead at the same time. So a proverbial fork in the road happened, but they were parallel. I then went on and continued quality assurance testing at a smaller company, which had later been acquired by SAP, but Concur Technologies, travel expense software, and spent what did I spend? I spent 2 years there before returning to Microsoft for 5 more years, and continuing on that sort of quality assurance software development engineering realm. In both of those sort of spaces, I learned more and more about both the UX experience of software in a workplace, the security aspect of that experience. And when I returned to Microsoft, I worked for the Windows Security Organization at the time, and our job was to create we were building the rights management platform, right? So if I don't even know it exists anymore. I think it's a different business SKU of Microsoft that we don't deploy here, but little red button at the top of your Outlook or your Word or your Excel or your PowerPoint doc, which you could append a encrypted private key, public key pair that allowed you to, enable and disable who could view that content wherever they resided, as long as they received that key pair match. So there was the first foray into, oh, security is interesting because good people do good things, but bad people want to access those good things. And I think that was sort of a jumping spot too. Now security's become interesting to me, and God, this reminds me of military again in some way. And I cared about security and doing the right thing, but I also cared about finding the bad actors at the same time.
Yeah, no, that's really cool, and it's kind of a little bit like you mentioned rights access, and who can access what, and it's not always the outside threat actors. It could also be the disgruntled employees just biding their time to steal all the clients.
Yeah,
So yeah,
yeah.
you kind of these days. No organization should go without some kind of visibility tool like that. But kind of switching gears a little bit onto the meat of things with your area of expertise these days in terms of like fraud prevention. And fraud used to mean like stolen credit cards and suspicious logins, but today it's far more complex and deeply embedded in our digital systems. How do you think, or how do you define modern fraud, in your role? What's kind of the fraud to?
Yeah, yeah, it's funny you bring up fraud. I don't know if I'm sure we all binge watch some sort of television series these days. I found myself a fan of Tom Hardy, and I'm watching Mobland these days,
So
and the
good.
word fraud and criminals, and it is great, right? And crooks is prevalent through that. Although that's a great story, and it's capturing my, a different side of us on the entertainment level, but it's there and it's intelligent, and I've watched this show, and I feel like I'm leaving with fraud and criminal activity will always exist. I don't know a world where it won't, whether you're in space and we're belters, or we're we're earthers, or we're Martians. um fraud will always exist. Someone's trying to find a shortcut. What's interesting and compelling and dangerous about it today is just as much as we tout the benefits and greatness behind AI, fraudsters and criminals are taking full advantage of its capabilities. In fact, it's doing it for them now, right? So, just like you can write a contract or a document or ask ChatGPT to cook your steak for you or tell you how to cook your steak, you can ask it to find any bloody gap hole doorway you can into some software, and it'll do it persistently until it finds a way, right? Providing that there's a gap
Yeah,
there.
unleash the agent
Exactly.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
the 30+ minute runtime that they're now increasing to. So it's kind of a, with the adage of the AI components now, would you say it's a double-edged sword or is it a net benefit? Because, whilst the AI technology helps the attackers, it's also a defensive tool.
Totally. Yeah, it's like machines fighting machines, right?
Of course, yeah,
Find
Starknet,
find the analogy and the entertainment industry and what is it? Skynet, right? I mean, Terminator
Skynet,
for
that's
that matter.
not Starknet.
Yeah.
Get my
Once that's a fear I actually have, though I don't spend too much time thinking about it, but it's happening, and I don't think people realize it to the degree that it has the potential to get there. Yeah, I think machines or AI fighting AI is just as relevant. At the same time, you could argue, well, whew, I can build a hyper intelligent technology stack through AI or machine learning that can just as well fight everything that the opposite AI is trying to do. And humans, God rest their soul, love their souls, can rest assured that will do the right job if manipulated and leveraged the right way. But it'll work at a speed and a scale that no human will be able to keep up with. We're going to have to trust it, I think. That's equally scary to me, right? I mean, but at the same time, you trust your car to do what it does when you get in it, and you push the pedal and it moves you forward or backward. In the early days of automobiles, people weren't as trusting about that capability, and here we are today. We blindly drive through lights sometimes. I'm sure you've had this experience, and you ask yourself, "Was that green or red? I don't even remember." You trust this instinct and the vehicle that you're in. So I think it's easy to get overly hysterical about AI for good and AI for bad. I think the bigger question is who's policing and monitoring it, and this maybe gets into some serious topics in the US today around this deregulation that's happening given our current political environment and the thoughts of that movement. And I think there's some interesting context to, is regulation too much and has it gone too far? Think about the European Union and GDPR and some of the strict rules on consumer rights and data access and retention or accessibility versus what you're seeing in certain factions of the United States government today, with sort of a pullback on the very strict SEC rules on public and private company trading and the cybersecurity sort of laws and regulations are put in place. I don't have the answer for that. I think the fact that it's being discussed is good. I think the fact that there is private sector and government sector involvement on the AI sort of program itself or on AI programs itself is good. I think there has to be a balance and a check that measures that balance. Who's right or who's wrong or how far the pendulum swings in which direction is to be determined, and figure that's left up to the greater minds that sort of are willing to put their neck on the line for that conversation.
Yeah, it's certainly a lot to wrap your head around and very multifaceted. I mean, until we hit the kind of singularity moment and everything implodes, I guess we'll just have to fight these, you know, social
Sentinels.
engineering and deepfake battles for the for the time being. But on our radar, when I'm going to events and things these days, like InfoSec in the UK is coming up, a well attended large cybersecurity show, and last year, the buzzword was co-pilots and AI and companies, uh, trying to trying to deploy it. And of course, there's all the questions around, well, how do you do that effectively? What do you need to have in place? What do you need to get ready? I mean, we help some of our clients these days with that, but Do you think organizations are actually ready for it, or is it just kind of a early adoption race?
Yeah, good question, Vitaly. I mean, I, like you, attended events in the last 3 years. I think it was 2 years ago now at a Seattle venture capital annual meetup. And, this was Chat GPT 2.5, maybe. I don't remember the numbers anymore. And that was the entire
Was that
thematic.
pre-open source or post,
Yeah, just prior
or
to
just
November of that year.
before it
So it would have
went
been in
to?
2023. Yeah, probably 2023. And that was the thematic, and the hype and energy around it was over the top. I was skeptical because, like anything, and thank you, Hollywood, but also just understanding some amount of fraction of technology, I thought, let's wait and see how exciting this really becomes, because AI is pretty dangerous if it's not managed in certain ways and our expectations. So a year after that same event, the mood was much more calmer and a little bit pulled back and subdued. Okay, it didn't do everything everyone expected it to do out of the gates. It wasn't as disruptive. It has a lot of runway to go, and it'll certainly run fast once it gets momentum. But I think it's the dust has settled, if you will. Now it's about tuning and tweaking, perfecting, and this is, of course, on the good side, but you could argue it's the same equal on the bad side. Um, any one of those algorithms and those services to be better and better at providing accurate results, right? And maybe that's a good segue into one of your topics earlier, which is, well, what about fraud? And in the space we spend time in, consumer verification at the end of the day. Um, I had two topics actually to bring up on this. One is Sam Altman's reveal of World One, the orb. If you've read about that and understand that. And two, ironically, I think since the last time we chatted or just had a quick sync, I had credit card fraud, occurrence on my own on my own sort of personal life, and it happened twice in literally a 30-day span with the same card. So I don't know if that's worth sharing, but as it relates to where's the problem that occurred and how did fraud occur, and where, who's accountable or who should be held responsible for that, or how do we fight that? I have ideas. I don't know where to take them because I don't own the industry. But if you embellish me for a sec, I'll tell you what happened. I got the, quintessential text message saying, "Hey, from my credit card, we've noticed an activity that seems unlike your spending behavior. If this doesn't look like your last expenditure or charge, please contact us. Here's the number." I didn't jump for the number. I decided to actually go onto the internet, find the actual credit card number through the internet, and I called that number. Lo and behold, it was not my credit card company. Gosh, surprises, right? That had contacted me. But because the bank is what it is and it's doing its right thing, they canceled the card, reissued me a new one. Here's where it gets fun. I hadn't received the card. I was out of town. And I get another text alert while I'm out of town. Card is not in hand. I only have the last four digits of the card because the bank had revealed what that was. I think that's interesting. They can do that, but there's a crack there. Um, I get another text articulating yet again another charge on that card that I had not possessed. I didn't know the 16-digit numbers for. And I quickly called the bank again on my own merit and said, "So you've contacted me," and said, "Yeah, we did actually contact you on this time. Great. I don't have the card. How is it absolutely possible that I could be charged for anything on this card?" "Oh, sir, it looks like," and this is no discredit to the wonderful help desk person on their side. They were great. "It looks like you're a victim of fraud." And I said, "Actually, I think you're the
No.
victim of fraud. I
Yeah.
don't even have the bloody card. It's sitting in a mailbox," and it was when I got home, unopened, unregistered, unenabled. "I think your supply chain is actually where the fraud's occurring at this point." So it's deeper down the stack, right? And that's a topic that's coming up more and more these days too. They issued me another card. I've since received that card, and I'm hoping, God willing, that thing is going to be okay. But now I have lack of trust in that bank and the credit card industry even more so, right? So what do we care about most? We care about our money, our assets, our equity. Unfortunately, it's just a way of life we have to accept. And as a result, it's tied directly to who we are as we navigate this planet, right? Our biometrics, our private information. Yeah, we spend a lot of time working on it and focusing on how to fight the bad actors, but we also are balanced with making sure that the good people, hopefully all of us on this call, are being justifiably verified for the right reasons so that we are, allowed entry into various whatever portals, technologies, infrastructure services, whatever we do every day-to-day life. It's a tough line, and that's where we do incorporate machine learning, artificial intelligence to help us look for trends, patterns, anomalies that are outside the source of truth, or the records that produce the documents in our own biometrics.
And is that just at the consumer level, or is it enterprise, corporate as well?
Yeah, good question. We focus on the consumer level only specifically, and not to make a shameless plug for Authentic ID, but that's our target market. I think the corporate level has been well managed, specifically with the enterprise software companies out there like Okta, Penguin Login that do identity access management. You're seeing them foray though into the consumer space because there's a tight correlation, right? You have all this information on citizens and employees in the enterprise market. They're also consumers out there in the public sector, and there's value in building solutions that meet both those needs inside and out. I think back to the supply chain conversation, that's probably the toughest part. And I think you made the analogy around, protecting your keep inside your employee base is just as difficult sometimes. I wrote a white paper on Boeing when Boeing had been manufacturing the 787 Dreamliner, the original, sort of revelation into that market. And the white paper was not a good white paper in so that it basically summarized the failures in the 787 project because there was so many second, third, fourth, fifth party supplier vendors that were supplying all this inventory that were being assembled then in some location here in Seattle or in North Carolina. And as a result, failures were happening on that aircraft en masse that I think it was 5 years delayed to market. So that's not a cybersecurity issue per se, but if you think about today's space and where do fraudsters, hackers, terrorists want to invoke harm, you know, without someone's ability to verify that contractor vendor is who they are and they're doing things for the right reasons and because they've been employed to, um, you now have a deeper problem, I think, that exists that both enterprise and consumer software and identity verification plays a bigger part of.
Yeah, certainly does. I mean, it was the first glimpse I had into it was the time I spent in China, in Southeast China, Guangzhou, not too far from Hong Kong. City of 17 million people. 17 was it? Yeah, well, I think it was about that. I know
It's a lot.
Chongqing is slightly bigger than that. Yeah, Chongqing is like 30 something, but and it was bizarre because obviously they were technologically advanced in terms of like their version of WhatsApp with WeChat. It's like your digital passport, your ID, and it's got everything again. It's got all your biometrics in there. And I think these days they can just walk up in a convenience store and just pay with their face with a facial recognition item. So it's kind of is that where you see Western society heading with authentication and biometrics? Because they're certainly, leading the way in that respect. It's everywhere. So their facial recognition cameras, it's on the streets, or is that too kind of police state, and the West would never adopt that?
I'm sorry for all the movie references I provide you, but Minority Report comes to mind, right? And the
Yeah,
Thought
right.
Police.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Britain's prevailed for a long time on CCTV in the entire sort of city market, if you will.
Yeah.
I think it's a great thing, and I say that for two reasons. One, I mean, it hopefully provides a safer environment. Of course, the opposite to that is, well, if the police are not honest and there's criminal activity behind that, then it's bad. And you've seen numerous movies around that. Well, just look at Mobland again. Um, I think we're actually behind in the U.S. market on accepting digital ID for, payment, procurement, etc. I'm not sure why this economy is slow. It's probably a government political, if not private sector reason, if not just rights and the good old sorry, it's escaping me, the U.S. constitutional rights for privacy and consumer protection. But I think that's where it should go. And I think modern Western civilization needs to get there. And so the question is, and this is what it comes down to in our business, is what's the source of truth, right? Um, you present your face, and for all intents purposes, unless you're physically standing there, we really have no way with deepfake criteria today as it is and prevalence of knowing that it's actually you. If it's like right now, this could be, for all I know, a deepfake version of Vitaly. And nice to meet you, by the way. Um, so how do we prove that? And it comes down to the source of truth. I think we'll end up getting to a more deeper biometric scan, a thumbprint, your eye, your retina, your blood sample, your DNA. I don't know, whatever is the truth. But even as Minority Report shows, you can still find criminal activity behind that by, conceivably replacing someone's eyeball. So where's that utopia going? I think there's value in that. I mean, I think there needs to be a source of truth that ensures trust, which is why I brought up the World One Orb, Sam Altman service that's being sort of published in the last couple of weeks. I don't know if you've seen that,
I've not
but
seen that actually.
oh
What is
yeah,
it?
it's exactly that. It's a retina scan of your eye, and it's embedded into basically a crypto hash on some wallet, digital wallet, and
Weren't
it
they
it
trying to roll
ensures
that
that
out
you are
in Spain to begin with? What they were doing, they were trying to recruit people to kind of get on board with it as
tested.
like beta test
Yeah.
it, yeah, but isn't it kicking up just a load of issues?
Probably in EU, I could see it kicking up a load of issues, right? Regulation over there is I think tighter and for the right reasons. So I believe I've seen it launched in 7 US states so far in the last month, and it
Okay.
continues to get out there. I saw a podcast from, not a podcast, a LinkedIn post from a gentleman that I'm friends with, and he tried it and said, interesting. It was not too terrible, pretty seamless as far as the sort of implementation went and the onboarding. I think the question is who owns that data, and is it always going to be trusted, even if it's encrypted? Is it a private sector? Is it a public sector? Who governs and controls whether that data is sold, manipulated, et cetera, et cetera? It always comes down to that, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
of course. It was. I've got a funny story actually. It's I was keeping an eye on when all the DNA testing and sequencing uh, toolkits started coming out. Like the mail order
23andMe.
things.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So it been going on for a while, and then I thought, oh, get my old man one of those. Yeah, he's turned 60 or so, so I'll get him one of that. Get his metrics. Be a fun present, something different. Like what you get a man who has everything. They get him one of these tests. He sends it all off. He gets all the results back, and bear in mind by this point I'm already working in cybersecurity, and and then I read the headlines, 23andMe breach, and, and
It's all
all
gone.
your data's gone.
It's all
Yeah.
gone. Yeah.
Now you're
Yeah.
getting cloned. Well, it might come back someday.
Right. Stem cells,
And I
everything. I
mean
mean,
that's
you can,
crippled them, hasn't it? They've selling off the company is going into administration. So
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I think it's a very real problem. I mean, nobody is trusted. Look at Google every day. I'd love to think that Google's doing good, but man, they're just being slapped with lawsuits after lawsuits. I mean, the largest one I think known to mankind just occurred in state of Texas, 200 something billion, $2 billion lawsuit for consumer data privacy leak or selling. I mean, I think I am still just astounded every time I happen to get on a social media platform, and lo and behold, it knows and is presenting me with everything possible I've just discussed or searched on Google in the last 2 minutes or 24 hours.
or spoke
And
about
now
in
it's
your
almost,
kitchen within earshot of Alexa.
yeah, yeah, or Alexa or Siri for that matter, though Apple
Yeah.
claims not to do that. But yeah, it's actually becoming annoying. I mean, the amount of golf club bags I've been presented in the last 24 hours just because I did one search is becoming it. It's made me disbelieve in the value in social media again, which I never really believed in it past 2016 when I left all the platforms. So yeah, who owns the data and are they a trustworthy source? I mean, I don't know that the government is the right source to own it. I certainly don't think that a private sector should own it outright. Um, maybe we should own it outright, but that means we're carrying around our little data farms. And, you know, I think you've got to arm citizens with a lot of technologies a lot of people don't understand. So that's not going to necessarily work. Maybe World One is sort of a pathway into that answer, but that's Skynet, right? Yeah,
Yeah, it's on the chain then, isn't it?
yeah, yeah.
Always there. It's like one of the previous episodes we did, and we were talking about saving passwords into Google Chrome, and the guest was saying, no, you should never do that because autofills into different apps or browsers and things like that. And I was like, okay, yeah, deleted everything off my Google, all my payments, all my passwords, and migrated because I'm a I don't like to spend money if I don't have to. So like a one password or one of the other alternatives, I was kind of like, well, I use Apple mostly, so I'll just use the new kind of Apple passwords keychain. But then it's all in the Apple ecosystem as well.
Right.
It's kind of like, can I trust that? It's all in one place, all eggs in one basket.
It's great
Don't
until
know.
they get breached and hacked like 23andMe, although you would hope that a company like Apple has a lot of gates and gate stops to prevent that, but there's no guarantees, right?
Yeah, iClouds were getting hacked, weren't they? So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah, no, it's ever changing landscape.
It's funny, there's
That's
this
what keeps it exciting.
I'm a big Formula One fan and I've actually studied, well, on a personal hobbyist level, the sponsorship and the cost of a car, right? Or what's called a livery, if you will, in Formula One nomenclature. And you look at all the logos that are sponsoring all these vehicles. And the last 4 years, there's been this prevalent march. Salesforce really got into it by basically becoming the big marquee along with AWS sponsor for the entire Formula One circuit. Well, now two cards have Keeper and one password and Okta emblazoned all of them. So I'm thinking, if I'm a terrorist hacker, the first thing I'm going to do is watch Formula One and say, who's got all the data and which one is privacy and security born? Let's get Sentinel One is on the back of one of the tail fins, or the diffusers. It's fascinating that sometimes private sector businesses get ahead of themselves because they want this celebrity status and recognition. Of course, it's about a click and marketing, and awareness. But sometimes I think, oh, maybe it's better off not to advertise who you are when you're in the security business, right? I mean, you're just opening yourself
They
up
all
to
do.
attack.
They all do. They all do. Everyone wants to be on a Formula One card. So is it Dark Traces there,
Or
CrowdStrike
trace, yeah,
on the
yeah.
McLarens and the
And
Mercedes.
banks, and banks are on them.
Thanks. Well, you can't because you can't do cigarettes and booze anymore, right? So because that's
No,
not doesn't align with driving generally speaking. I
I
think the
remember the
Johnny Walker
Johnny Walker
and
car
Marlboro,
and the
Marlboro,
Rothmans car and the
yeah,
Marlboro. Yeah,
that's
yeah,
it.
those were
That's it.
great days.
When Formula One drivers used to be real bad boys. Do you think we'll ever
Smoking.
see authentic ID on the side of a
Funny story.
on
Funny
the hash,
story.
maybe?
And maybe this is probably the answer as to why not. Not certainly in my knowable lifetime. Our previous CEO, and there's probably a reference to why, had pioneered down a path to engage with the McLaren team, and we found our way. I wasn't there, but was invited into one of the paddocks at the first Miami race, which was 3 years ago. And he had
Got a
asked me,
chance to
he's
meet
like,
Zach. Yeah.
yeah, he met Zach. I did not. And but he'd asked me, he's like, Chris, tell me how the advertising and sponsorship works in the car. And I was like, well, purely out of personal interest, this is what I know. There's a dollar value for every part of that vehicle. And minimum entry is not cheap, but I think you can get in for $1 million or maybe even 2 million. And I said, but you don't get a lot of camera time, and it's all premised on how that car is doing and which television rights is watching that car, blah, blah, blah. He got pretty serious about it. We went we appeared, a couple of our employees, not myself or executives, at a couple events. And I remember thinking, way too soon for a company like us to be in that space. That's a very costly expenditure. The return on that is not going to reveal itself, let alone does it even do that for the larger companies if it's not just celebrity status to get on the damn Formula One car. So,
Yeah, I
you
mean,
know,
it's rare that I will go, oh, what is that? I've never seen it before, and then
right.
Google it. Right?
And now I'm going to buy
Sometimes
it.
there
I'm
is.
going to
I'm
buy
like
it now.
curiosity will get the better of me. I'm like, never heard of that company name. Like, what are they doing? But yeah, it's not how I would go out shopping for, a new cybersecurity tool.
No, no, that doesn't breed trust to me. That just breeds probably a misappropriation of business or corporate funds, if you will. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I think did we want to cover off anything else? Did you want to add any last little bits? And then obviously we'll cut this part out.
No, not really. I mean, we could deep dive into more Hollywood movies, but I think if there's
Yeah,
anything that's
we,
interesting to watch.
we'd be really off topic then, but Mobland is amazing. I just watched the last episode yesterday.
Did you?
Well, the latest one. I think it was episodes 6, 7.
6 or 7,
It's
yeah.
anything Guy Ritchie is typically
Oh
pretty
God, I'm
decent.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm with you. He's a wonderful director, producer, writer. So is Taylor Sheridan, by the way, if you've never watched any of his shows. Yeah, I think if leaving off, look, I am just like my peers, very interested, cautious, and optimistic about what artificial intelligence can do, both for companies like us, how it might eclipse ID verification and or surpass it and take ownership of its own right. But I also think it's going to create another risk space that terrorists, fraudsters, criminals will exploit and take full advantage of. And that scares me, especially for the generation that doesn't understand that, or the generations that don't understand that. Um, you know, remember the days where you got an email from a Saudi Arabian prince claiming to have $1 million check for you, and all you had to do was say yes, or lo and behold, you received a check that was $55 over the amount they actually were going to pay you for a good. You know, you have to do is write them the difference. This is different now, right? If fraud can occur at the supply chain level behind the banks that are supplying credit cards to people like me and you, I'm worried about my assets sitting in those entities and how they're verifying that. And our customers are banks, and they're almost too regulated themselves to see their own, how do I put this, tail from their front, you know. But there's got to be more time and attention spent using technologies like us to enable their consumer protection, not just a checkbox, if you will.
Yeah, good point to finish on. It's ultimately the consumer, isn't it, that makes these choices, and that's why we're probably seeing a lot more move to digital currencies because not your keys, not your crypto, and your money in the bank is also kind of not your money because you could go and request it back and then they say sorry,
Yeah,
the
it's been
computer says
invested
no.
elsewhere, or we've lost
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
Yeah,
we
yeah,
lost it.
yeah.
Cool story.
Well, here's a
Oh,
here's a
thank
question
you.
to leave,
Yeah,
yeah, to leave off
yeah,
with
go on.
you, and maybe for some of your other consumers or sorry, your other attendees. How many people do you think actually vet the security of the bank they plan on doing business with or depositing their funds into?
That's what no hardly any I'd imagine because that's why they get you when you're young, right? So you get your student current account or even earlier than that your first ever bank account. And I think I actually switched bank accounts, but I was one for a long time. And a lot of people will typically stay with one financial institution their whole
Yeah,
lives,
yeah.
if they don't know any
Regardless
better.
of whether
So
they've
yeah,
been breached or
yeah,
hacked, right? They don't even
yeah,
know half the
yeah.
time. Yeah,
Just
I
that
think
friction, isn't it? Friction changing to yeah, relocating your funds and so on. But yeah, certainly the financial literacy and the security literacy probably isn't quite there in the broader.
No, and it's not that hard, honestly, Vitaly, right? Like you can transfer funds electronically from one bank to another these days pretty
Yeah,
seamlessly,
exactly.
or through these third-party transactions technologies like Square or Venmo or PayPal. I think more people need to be aware of, a bank's history. I mean, and question that as far as it relates to where they actually put their assets and their crown jewels.
Yeah, just don't go to any Cypriot banks. That'll be probably the tip of the day.
Fair enough.
But
Fair
they have, I
enough.
think they have tightened their regs since 2013. So yeah, maybe on the overcautious side now.
Well,
Very difficult to open an account.
If Mobland tells us what to do, there still seems to be value in carrying bundles of wrapped cash in your hand as a means
Plus,
to
you
do
feel like an
business.
absolute boss doing so, right? So
Yeah, 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 yeah. Here's 10,000 pounds, whatever, like who carries that around?
that's how we roll. Awesome. Thank you very much, Chris. It was a pleasure speaking with you, and yeah, hope to see you soon again.
Likewise, thanks for the fun. I appreciate it, Vitaly. Have a great day.
Likewise.